Polarity counseling arises naturally from the polarity cosmology, in which the mind is never separate from the body. So physical conditions are seen as always having an emotional or a mental correlate. And briefly reviewing the polarity cosmology, Dr. Stone proposed that our situation is that we're a unit of consciousness coming into a form. There's a first appearance is very subtle, and then that crystallizes or coalesces into something more dense, and finally takes the form of something quite dense and physical. And these are the first is the mind is like a blueprint for everything that will follow. The feelings are the actualization or manifestation process for the mind's blueprint, bringing it into form. We could also use the phrase impulses. And then the physical body is seen as the result of this ongoing process. And this is happening on a micro level, on a macro level, at every scale and in every time frame. And we would just observe that in healthcare generally, there's a tendency to isolate the physical body. The physical body, if you go for a medical appointment or if you're seeking care for a particular condition, physical condition, then very rarely will there be the question asked, how's it going in your life? What are your fundamental attitudes and expectations, and how might that play into your physical condition? So polarity is really almost unique, I think, in that it holds the totality, the holistic nature of human experience as a founding principle for all of its health care. And for that reason, polarity counseling is inevitable. That is, we need to have a techniques and a methodology and a concept for accessing the mental and the emotional layers. So our basic principles for polarity counseling, number one is going to be we're seeking ways of supporting the mental, emotional layer with an intention of helping undo fixation. The fundamental idea of all polarity therapy is that health is present when we have movement, and problems arise when we have fixation. So in the mental layer, this could be re-examination of attitudes and expectations. In the feelings layer, it could be an inquiry into what is the nature of true feelings and how they may have become fixated in a certain way. And in the physical body, especially with body work, the whole point of polarity therapy body work is to get movement where there was fixation. A second theme in polarity counseling is empowerment. The polarity principles involve the concept that the clients gradually are taking more and more responsibility for their conditions. And this is somewhat upside down in today's world, where often people give up their self-responsibility. They think their health is going to come from the outside, from external authorities or external agents. And then a third principle that would suggest for polarity counseling is the idea that gentle is more effective than dramatic. Slow and steady wins the race. There are many diverse methods used for polarity counseling. They are mainly borrowed from other sources. People who studied polarity also studied psychotherapy, and they found certain common grounds, certain principles, ways in which polarity principles could be recognized in other methods. The first approach that Dr. Stone used was a lifestyle approach. He believed that if we could do certain things for ourselves, we could find wellness. And from a counseling point of view, he particularly recommended for the mental layer, the reducing or minimizing the use of intoxicants, and then on a feelings level, maximizing the clarity of relationships, and on a physical level, really paying attention to diet. The basis for polarity counseling significantly is the so-called sun and moon model, which I can briefly show on this diagram that most activities, most relationships, we can identify a giving and receiving dynamic, a phenomenon in which there's a speaker and a listener, and then a return conversation, and then a listening on the other side. And in this way, relationships tend to be reciprocal and polarized in their action. How this plays out in practicality is, in the Orient, there are thought to be 4 sources of disease, 4 places where the sun and moon dynamic can go wrong. Yang, too much or too little, and yin, too much or too little. Only 4 sources of problems from a fundamental polarity energy exchange. The yang energy could overwhelm the yin. That would be called a tyrant. That would be too much yang. Or it could withhold its signal. That would be no outgoing energy, and the so-called wimp, or the restrained, too little yang. On the yin side, the yin could fail to give a return signal, could just receive whatever the yang is doing. That would be called the doormat. Or it could give such a harsh return signal that the yang energy is nullified. That would be called the so-called critic. So in polarity counseling, if we find a person with physical problems, this would be a first place to look. That perhaps in their life somewhere they are leaning into the 4 possibilities for this fundamental dynamic not working anymore. In the 1960s and early 1970s, some of Dr. Stone's students were attending his classes, and at the same time they were attending the classes of Fritz Perls, founder of Gestalt technique. And they recognized that one part of Gestalt methodology actually was using polarity therapy principles. So the 2-chair technique, which was developed in Gestalt, was adopted as a way to explore mental and emotional territory in a polarity therapy model. And basically, the 2-chair technique, we have some chairs set up here, involves the client sitting in one chair and speaking to an empty chair while the practitioner is observing. And the client in one chair might pose a particular question or be studying a particular topic, and they can express that in one chair, and then the facilitator would watch for the right opportunity and instruct the client to switch over to the other chair. Sitting in the other chair, there's a complete experience of not that. Whatever was being stated here, now we have a fresh perspective on it. Another important element in polarity counseling is what we call body, low, slow loop. And this is a technique which we have adopted from the work of Peter Levine and his somatic experiencing, as described in the book Waking the Tiger. Peter Levine studied with Dr. Stone in the 60s. So body means bringing the attention into the body. Low means descending view, a downward interest, inquiry of our consciousness into the body. Slow means asking very specific questions. And in this way, we engage the curiosity and slow down the thought process. And then finally, the most important part is loop. We instruct the clients, we train them how to move their attention from the primary area of attention to their feet or their fingertips or outside the body, somewhere else, and then back. The same amount of time is spent in the body as on the periphery or externally, and then back and repeat. So I hope you find this interesting, and we'll follow up with some training and learning more about how to use polarity counseling as part of your polarity therapy practice. It belongs in the full palette of what polarity therapy really has to offer.